All right, Mark, coming live here all the way from Australia. Thanks for coming on my little humble podcast. I appreciate it.
No worries, Andrew. It's a blessing.
And Mark, and for people who don't know, the way I found you was through the Righteous Man podcast. You do that. You're one of three members, three friends, I think, who do that together, right?
Yeah, that's right.
For those who don't know about the Righteous Man, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So we started September 2020, so over a year ago now. Yeah, and the podcast actually was Dave and Ray's idea completely. So they just, they were having all these conversations that we ended up having on the podcast on their own, and they found that a lot of their other mates had similar questions and similar questions in their head. And similar dilemmas. So, they thought, why not start a podcast? And, that seemed to be the trend of what everyone was doing. So we jumped on it. Yeah.
And you say similar. I love that you used the word mates right off the bat. I was, I'm more of like a bro and dude kind of guy here in LA, but yeah. So when you say mates, like literally the podcast is actually like geared towards guys, right?
Well, what? Sorry.
Like when you say other mates had the same questions and you guys kind of came up with the podcast idea, like literally the podcast is geared towards men, right?
Yeah, it was completely aimed at men, and just extending some of these conversations we're already having, and putting it in a podcast form that other people might relate to, and they might kind of trigger their own conversations with other people. So yeah.
I noticed there seems to be like a lot of podcasts coming out of Australia. I don't know if that's because Upper Room Media is pushing that, or is it the other way around, or how's that working?
Well, yeah. So Upper Room Media, like we never used to really do podcasts until initially we actually came up with the idea of just creating one of our original podcasts, because there was a couple of ones out of the States coming out, and so we thought, why not start kind of an original podcast, and we've got a studio here and stuff. So we thought we've got the capability for it. So yeah, it started with the Purpose podcast, and then there was another one, which is the Mommy podcast, which is two of our ladies here at church, just kind of discussing some of the issues and struggles that some Christian mothers face. So there was that one, and then we came along. So yeah, it just kind of seemed to be, and I think in general, podcasts seem to be kind of a growing trend with the world in general. Like it seems to be the preferred kind of format that people consume content in, instead of, I don't know what else is there, I guess audiobooks and books and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
I think I'm starting to notice that podcasts they're growing, definitely. I mean, I think we're still at the peak of it, but the way they're consumed, I think, is a little different now. I think people want to see the podcast. They want to see the YouTube video version. Maybe that has something to do with like we're not driving as much, pandemic, blah blah. We
noticed big changes in like engagement with COVID, and so when like the majority of our listener base is in Australia, so we noticed that when Australia went into that lockdown that we just went into, that we came out of this year, like our listenership kind of decreased.
Well, I don't know if you guys are still out of it, but we can get into based on what I'm seeing. It's like I'm surprised you were allowed to get out of your house today, but no,
we're out of it, thank God. But yeah, we noticed that the less people were commuting, the less our listenership was. So definitely has something to do with people's like commuting times and daily habits, and like personally, like for me, like I went from a job that was driving 1 hour a day to working from home, and like all this, like even like sermons and podcasts and everything that I would listen to normally just dropped off completely, because
same with me. I don't listen to that stuff as much because I don't have like dead time to kill. I would either like listen to a podcast or a sermon or just make phone calls during drives. But
even just like time to kind of de-stress after the day of work, or think through how things went or whatever. You don't get that time anymore. Like you actually have to be quite like intentional about making that time. That's which, like, probably for someone who has like a family and kids, it's even harder, because you kind of, if you're working from home, you log off and you've got everyone's right there. You don't have that time to yourself. So yeah, it's an interesting change.
All right, so I want to talk to you about well, let me ask you a question. This might make you nervous, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
You grew up, you lived in Australia your whole life?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the most courageous thing you've done, like, in your life?
Ooh, I think probably leaving home, like moving out of home after, like, I don't know how, I know in the States it's a bit different, but in Australia, like, most people don't leave home for university. You tend to go to university where your state is, or like where your home is, because most courses are offered in every state. So we just don't have that culture of leaving home. So leaving home for university was probably a big step, and then leaving home after, like staying away from home for work, and just to kind of explore a different city was probably, I'd say, the most courageous thing I've done.
And how far away from home did you move?
So it's another city, so it's hour and a half flight, I'd say.
Hour and a half flight? Okay. All right. So it wasn't like you were coming home every weekend sort of deal.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I think here it's kind of a mix. It's whatever you want. I think a lot of people do move out and live in the dorms and things like that, but a lot of people stay home as well, because there's just a lot of options of schools to go to.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that means you're not out on the streets right now of Melbourne, protesting the COVID lockdowns and all that stuff, right?
No. I'm based in Sydney, so no protesting here, thank God.
Okay. Oh, wait, how far are the two?
So Melbourne and Sydney are an hour.
Drive? A flight?
Drive? 9 hours. Yeah.
Are you guys kilometers or miles?
We're kilometers. So
convert it for me, or else I'm
we
actually
have a logical system of measuring things.
You're not gonna get a debate from me on that, but
yeah. So I think 1 mile is 1.6 kilometers. So I think it's about 1,000 kilometers. So it's about 600 or 700 miles, maybe.
Okay, cool. All right, that was kind of fast computing. Are you in the STEM? Are you in the sciences or math or something?
Healthcare. So I guess
healthcare.
So.
All right, not really.
Not at all.
All right, so in doing your podcast, was kind of one of your goals to get at, well, maybe you disagree with me, but I kind of look around in our society today and I don't see that same courage, that same masculinity, that same, bravery or the things, maybe we saw before. Part of that could just be like our generation, the last 50 years or so, there hasn't really been let's say 30 years, there hasn't been a kind of event, a war or something that just prompted that. It compelled you to have to be a certain type of person. Life, for the most part, I think for the average person growing up in the West, at least, is relatively comfortable. It's relatively simple. You're not faced with too many challenges. So is it that there's less courage, or that there's less opportunity for courage? Or do you think that there are just as many courageous people as there was before, but we just don't recognize it, or it's manifests in a different way? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah, there are a lot, like, if you go back like 1950, there was like, a war in almost every part of the world, and most people were called on to fight. And if there wasn't a war, there was a plague, or there was an invasion, or there was something. So yeah, like it's like if you look at all like the normal kind of statistics and metrics that they use to measure, well-being and how well the world is going and how well off we are, like the world has never been, like we've never been as well off and wealthy and comfortable as ever in history. Like it's as good as it's been ever at this point in time, including like world poverty and including sickness and death rates and all that sort of thing. Like the world is as good as it has ever been. But how that relates to courageousness, yeah, I think there's just possibly less opportunity. And I think also with the digital age, I think that has made it easier to be less courageous. Like it's not as important now to be courageous because you can hide behind technology. You can hide behind the digital persona. You can hide behind, you can fight with someone completely online and there'll be basically no ramifications in terms of you'll never probably have to face that person.
Right.
So
have you ever gotten into a fight?
Online?
No, in person.
Oh, in person?
Like a real fight. You don't have to answer. You don't know. Let's not incriminate you.
Well, like we had an indoor soccer game a week ago, and it wasn't the friendliest of games. But probably like high school. I remember high school, like because it was an all boys school, so like fights and stuff were pretty common.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a rite of passage. I don't encourage fighting, but I think like in high school. I don't know how it is now. I imagine they're all not fighting and just playing video games together, but I don't know if that's the actual case. Yeah, but I feel like I had at least I had a few like serious fights in high school.
Oh, I agree with you. I think like learning to confront people and learning, like even like in psychology, like there's a very important concept which is teaching kids how to play, and teaching kids like how to rumble and how to fight and how to what they're capable of and what they're not capable of and what they should be accepting of and not, all that sort of thing. Like that's very important for actually kids becoming social and growing up, socialized. Whereas you put kids who, and you can tell straight away there are some kids who have just never been put in a situation that demands them to stand up for themselves, and they're always very like timid and they're scared to confront people and they're scared to stand up for themselves, versus kids who have grown up maybe with brothers or sisters, and they're used to people fighting with them. They're used to having to stand up for themselves and that sort of thing. So I think you can tell a little bit with that as well. So I think for high school, like for boys especially, like for men, I feel like learning how to argue, learning how to confront things in a healthy way is important.
So you mentioned socialization. When I think of that, I actually think that's probably another reason actually there's less courage, because I don't know how schooling is in Australia, but here, at least in the States, it's very much a reward punishment system. Just from the time you enter, we call it kindergarten. I'm obviously like so oblivious to like your customs and what you guys call things. So just if you just ignore all that little stuff. But
kindergarten is
but so from the time you're entering kindergarten, 4 or 5 years old, even until you're a working person, you're always being like judged by some sort of metric and either punished or rewarded for it. Okay. And what I think this kind of puts kids from an early age into a little box of approved thinking, approved actions, approved ways of expressing yourself, etc. And because the consequences of going outside of that, deviating from that, are repeatedly throughout your life met with, from when you're a kid, a frown maybe, until, you're an adult, to maybe getting terminated. People are disincentivized to be courageous, because is it courageous to do the thing that you're rewarded for? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'll leave that for you to chime in on, but what do you think that whole role of just socialization and
Yeah, I mean, I
reward
think
and punishment.
I think, like, I don't think you make a good point, but I think like we'd be careful to, I don't know if you guys have the same, but to throw out the baby with the baby water,
Yeah.
because I think like reward and punishment plays a very important role, in like what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior, and in actually to teach someone that, to teach a kid who doesn't understand, who might not understand why rules are in place, you reward them, and you vice versa, you punish them. What those rewards and punishments are, like, that's probably up for debate. And
Right.
I'm sure Egyptian parents would argue very strongly for a certain type, but I think there's it plays a role, because if you like, and I see that I would actually say that one of the reasons why we might, why maybe courage is observed less, is there's actually no punishment anymore. Like, you can do whatever you want, you can be whatever you want, and there's no one to tell you it's right or wrong. Like, whatever you think is right, that's right, and there's no one to tell you it's wrong.
Well,
So
I don't agree with that. I mean,
yeah,
I don't agree with that, because people will tell you it's right. It's okay, whatever you think, if that's actually like the now accepted view, right? So
yeah,
if you want to be, transgender, right, for
yeah,
example,
yeah,
right now, okay, maybe that, I'm not saying that. I mean, I think that I wouldn't call it courage for reasons we'll get into later, but at least it takes some boldness, right? But not as much as 5 years ago, because 5 years ago it would be more punished, not necessarily punished in like some overt way, but how people look at you.
yeah.
But
No,
we're kind of
I
talking.
guess my point is, that um that I feel like the world is moving like in a direction where no one is willing to call out anymore what is absolutely true and what is absolutely not true.
Oh yeah.
And everything's just become relative. Like, if you take like I'm the transgender example is hard, because it's a very complex issue as well.
Right.
But I mean, let's just take an example of, a simple school test. Like, it's accepted that if you get 20% on your test, that you didn't do well. And 20 years ago, it would be accepted that you shouldn't be rewarded for that. You should probably be encouraged, and you should be, if you did try your best, and if that was the best that you could do, that should be encouraged, and you should be shown how to do better. But it shouldn't necessarily be rewarded as much as the person who worked just as hard or worked harder and did better. Because then, well, what's the incentive to actually, for anyone to actually do better, if there's nothing that's being rewarded, or vice versa, if there's nothing that's being, criticized? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think the like a reward punishment, I don't think that's an inherently bad thing in and of itself. I just think it has.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think it has consequences that it may stunt the ability to be courageous and to be just counter.
I think that comes down to what type of reward punishment system you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we take a bit, yeah.
Well,
sorry, go for it.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, fundamentally, because there's a reward punishment system, that means that there's an established norm. Because you to reward someone or punish someone, you have to already in your mind and put in their mind that this is what is acceptable. If you deviate, and I think just simply the fact of, and we'll get into like right now what courage is, but I think courage, like in essence, part of it is deviating from what is acceptable, right? So if you have a reward punishment system in place, and I'm not saying that's an inherently bad thing, I just think because it's there, it's as a function of that, it's going to stunt deviation. And deviation may be something that's courageous, and may just be deviation that's not courageous. I'm not saying all deviation is courage. But it could be courage, and it just kind of I think conditions people to be less courageous, because in part of being courageous is deviating, in my opinion, and to deviate is not met with reward, because if it was, then everybody would be doing it and everybody would be courageous, right? So,
of course. But then I think you could argue that if you were to get rid of a punishment, for example, well, then there's no point, then even courageousness would kind of disappear with it as well, because there is no more difficulty to deviate. Like there's nothing to actually, because I think courage brings with it an element of suffering, an element of like sacrificing something for whatever you've stood up for or whatever you've decided to take on. There has to be an element of sacrifice, or an element of punishment, not punishment, but something that you've suffered for that. But if you get rid of that system where that keeps people in line to some sort of standard, then can you even argue that courage would exist? Like if something, like you said,
no, it's a good question. It's like so when I kind of think about this with schooling, I don't know if you ever listen to Pink Floyd, but they have a song. It's called "Another Brick in the Wall."
Yeah.
And I think it essentially hits on this theme of school making everyone another brick in the wall, right? Just another cog in the machine. And they don't accept, just being different is frowned upon. But that's a good question. Maybe that song and those artists came out of that system, right? And they also became different because of the system, right? So I think the system can create courageous people, but part of me thinks like it produces less of them.
I guess it depends as well. Like, well, what system are we adhering to, or what's the truth? Because like for a Christian, then courage is deviating from what the world says is true. And we know that what the world says is true is not necessarily what God says is true.
Right.
So, but for the world, it's actually, they would probably see it as the opposite, as to be Christian is just to be, compliant, to be submissive to a set of rules, to be passive.
Well, even think about that. All right. So let's think about that. Like you bring up Christianity, right? And I think this is a good example, because 1,000, 2,000 years ago, there really was no schooling system of rewards and punishment. And when you compare our current generation of Christians to 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, I mean, who's more courageous? I don't know. I think the era of martyrs and monks and all of that stuff.
And I think also like the context matters, because sure, we don't have martyrdom in its like form that we know it, where killing people and whatever, but I think that the concept still exists. When someone defends the faith, when someone puts their puts their life on the line, whether it's a job, whether it's their reputation, whatever it is, it's still a form of martyrdom.
But aren't people even hesitant to do that?
Of course, yeah. I completely agree with you. I think courageousness, in Christianity has, I guess you'd say decreased, but I think also it's just hard to judge, because there are still courageous people, but they might not be in the limelight, so you might not see them. But courage, there's the parable of the talents, which is it talks about the guy that got the 5 and the 2 and the 1. And then at the end, the message, is if you are faithful in the little. And I think courage can also be argued that it's about being courageous in those tiny little moments when no one sees, because courage in front of people might just be arrogance or might just be confidence. But I think courage when no one is watching, when like you're still going to suffer, but no one will notice you, you could argue that that's maybe a bigger form of courage.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we don't see that as much, but it still happens. Like in that, in the workplace, when that one person stands up for themselves, or that one person puts their reputation on the line to say that they're Christian, or to say that this is what I believe in. but no one sees it, that's still courage.
Okay, I wanna kind of keep going with the Socratic method that we're doing here and try to really flush out what courage is. I want to start with let's use
you just got to be careful because we're quite uneducated in Australia, so don't use long words.
I doubt that.
Yeah,
but don't worry. I'm like a 3-syllable maximum kind of guy, so but I'll try to keep it to 2 syllables per word. But this is a person's name, so it's more than 2 syllables. Aristotle. You've heard of him? Has he made his way there to Australia?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're still learning how to spell him, but
he's got this book, the Nicomachean Ethics, and it's all about virtues. The whole book is about virtues. And for Aristotle, virtues are, and I'm dumbing this down, and I'm no expert on Aristotle philosophy, but it's essentially like a mean in between. So a virtue is a mean in between two extreme ends of the same of a vice, right? So he would say courage is the mean between, on the one end, the vice is cowardice, and on the other end, it's like brashness, overconfidence, like just recklessness, right?
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that definition first? Like, that's a baseline, but do you think that's a good definition?
Yeah, I like that because like that sits pretty well with like what we would say is like in general with Christianity, like we always take the middle ground. The extremes are not good. Like if you look at cowardice, well, cowardice is cowardice. That's pretty obvious. But overconfidence and brashness, that's basically just courage, but without wisdom,
right.
Like without.
That's exactly what he says. Actually, it's without knowledge, without wisdom. So let's say, for example, you were in war, and you're like the last soldier left, and there's like 50 in front of you, and you could just live to fight another day, but like you charge into battle and die right away. Like I don't think Aristotle would say. I don't know if we would say that's courageous.
Maybe it's bravery, but I think courage is a bit of a deeper level.
Okay. So let's just keep on exploring. Like, if you go skydiving, like, would you say that's a courageous activity? Or like, is that person courageous?
No, I think that's just taking a risk, and maybe if you have an extreme fear of heights and you've had a very bad experience, and maybe for you it's a very tough thing to actually face, then maybe for you personally, I think courage, like you could probably define it as like a general thing, like what society would see as courage, but I think for every person as well, like for someone, for example, who let's take someone who's autistic, for example, and even actually, like, let's take a big biblical example. Like we had a youth meeting last night, and the talk was on Zacchaeus, and the whole community around him probably didn't see what he did as courageous. They just probably thought he was an idiot and silly and just gone crazy. But for him to go in the midst of all these people that hated him and climb up a tree, and it's funny, like one of the church fathers actually says, like, one of the reasons why it was courageous is, or brave, or whatever you want to call it, is sometimes men didn't wear like undergarments, so for him to climb up a tree everyone could see, which is like in a metaphorical way, he did expose himself to Christ, and he physically exposed himself.
That's a deep meditation right there.
I can't remember what it was maybe it's St. Gregory or St. Basil, I can't remember. But yeah, like he showed a lot of courage for himself personally, because not only was he going to embarrass himself in front of all these people that hated him, and he was a man of immense wealth, obviously, but he was going to expose himself in front of Christ, in front of all these people as well. So I think for him that took courage, and I think that's a great example of courage in the pursuit of something good, like in the pursuit of truth, which is Christ. Like he pursued something truthful, and that was courageous. But no one else thought it was courageous. Everyone else just thought, "Who's this crazy man climbing up a tree?" So I think.
Okay, so let's add that element, because I think that is an important element of courage, and that the thing you're doing should be noble. It should be like worthwhile. It should be like some endeavor for truth, or something like that. So the skydiving, although like it could be specific to some person, that might show some bravery or something.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like a really noble pursuit, right?
Exactly. I agree.
So, okay, so it's on some kind of mean, and this is just we're just thinking out loud here. In between cowardice and like brashness, it should be towards some noble endeavor.
I think so, yeah.
Now, is there a difference between courage in the world and like Christian courage, do you think? Like,
I think keep going.
Yeah, so just like looking at it both ways, if I take something that's obviously courageous in the world, like, becoming a firefighter and, putting your life on the line to put out fires. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that always something we would consider courageous? Not that specific example, but just worldly courage. Is it always the same as Christian courage? Like, what's the overlap there? And where do they part ways, if any?
Well, I think like the overlap is what the part of it which people see, which is I'm doing something that's difficult, and I'm doing something that is hard for me to personally come to terms with, and that goes against everything that I would normally do, and that makes me stand out from the rest. I think there's a bit of overlap there, but I think probably where they deviate is the purpose of courage, like what you're standing up for and why you're doing it. Because I think as the world has become less religious and less Christian, let's say, the world has had to find other reasons for being courageous. Because there doesn't really seem to be any more value. The world doesn't place any more value on what's absolutely true, which is God. That doesn't seem to really be something that people value anymore. So I feel like people have to put value on other things now, which is their own truth, or what the relative truth. And you hear that word a lot, which is, oh, it's my truth.
Right.
And sure, like things, you have your own experience, sure, and that experience is very personal to you and very unique to you, and it's your experience. But your truth doesn't mean that there is no absolute truth. And I feel like we've just cancelled out absolute truth, and it's whatever you say is true. No one is there to say anymore, well, even though you believe this to be true, you could actually potentially be wrong as well, and there might actually be something wrong to this. But no one, like, it's just no one is there to say that anymore. So like, back to the point, like what the world sees as courageous, I think, is just to say what you believe to be true. It's not to actually go against what everyone else says to be true.
Right. Yeah. So like theoretically, like in the world, almost any act can be courageous, even if it's fundamentally a wrong thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point, actually.
And I see that, like, you see, just thing with like the media and stuff that like 50 years ago would have just been seen as it's the norm, is now, it gets celebrated as, wow, this is courageous.
Right.
Like, because you don't see it as much, maybe, or I don't know, we just Like it's the
Man
idea of like,
marries his long-term girlfriend. What a hero.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
The
Like,
courage.
yeah, like
Had a
commitment
baby
is,
out of wedlock and stuck around.
yeah, commitment to a partner long term. You know,
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
married. That's like a big thing now. Like that's, and it's just, I think it's the fact that we've become very like it just what I was saying before. Like because now you can be courageous about anything. Like anytime, like I proclaim that I'm a tree and I've proclaimed that to the world, and because that's what I believe to be true, and if I told that to everyone, now I'm courageous. And like
Right.
because now everyone can be courageous and everyone can do the smallest of things and be courageous. Now nothing is courageous. Does that make sense?
Right. But I feel like deep down, people know what the truth is and what real courage is, although we may try to fool ourselves.
Yeah.
And back to one of our earlier points, I think
Yeah.
one area where courage in the world and in Christianity separate is that there's no courage and obedience in the world. Like I was saying before, just following that punishment and reward system. There's no courage in that. But in Christianity, obeying God's will and living your life according to God's will, that is courageous,
Yeah.
right? Because it's
And that's still like,
probably gonna conflict with the world to some extent.
and that like a bit like in Christianity as well, there's still an element of reward and punishment because we know that the reward of obeying God and listening to His commandments and being close to Him is that He is close to us, and that He will, it's not necessarily a okay, do this, get this kind of vending machine transaction kind of thing, but
Right.
there is still an inherent reward in what we do, and I think that's a natural, like that's you could almost say a natural law, like that's something that you can't really get rid of. Like you could almost say that like it's like the Newton's laws of physics. Like for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and for every thing that we do in Christianity, good or bad, there is a reaction to it. There is either, if we decide to separate ourselves from God, well, then there is the consequences of that. And if we decide to attach ourselves to God, well, there is also the consequences of that, which are good. And I don't think you can really, you can't really cancel that out. Like that'll be there regardless, because it's in the parables, it's in the Bible, like it's all throughout the Bible. Like the people that there was consequences to everyone's actions, good or bad. And that's kind of a reward and punishment system almost in a way.
Right. And kind of the missing link in Christianity for a person to be courageous is that faith, right?
Yeah.
Faith in Christ, faith in the resurrection. Without that, what really keeps your courage? How do you even become courageous? Which is why I think it's so admirable in the world when someone displays any form of courage.
Yeah.
Because most people don't have any real strong convictions. They don't have this deep faith. So
well, that's what your article said. Like the one that you sent me actually was really good. So it was, I'm just going to quote it, and it was saying, the humanistic virtue of courage becomes grounded in those theological virtues that spring from revelation and assurance of salvation. Courage is above all linked with faith. Without courage, faith is empty. A faith that is mere theoretical conviction or verbal formulation is no faith at all. Faith is faith only when it has the courage of its convictions. It must be transformed into the life power of one's very existence. The test of faith is one's willingness to risk the comforts of life in its behalf. The courage of faith is based then not only on conviction of truth, but also on ultimate trust of God. So I think you're right. Like without courage, we can't really say we have faith, because courage, I think, is what gives our faith power. Like it's what gives us action. Like if Thomas, for example, he doubted, but he had the courage to go and actually test his doubts and test his faith to make sure, because he could have just sat at home and just not, wallow kind of in his doubt and then allowed his doubt to continue. But for him to actually, and that probably would have been the easier thing, because to not be Christian, like to not believe in the resurrection of Christ, probably would have been an easier option for him. Looking at what was happening in the immediate period of what happened after Christ's death and resurrection. For a Jew to believe that Christ resurrected, that was dangerous. So for him to continue in his doubt, that was actually probably an easier thing to do. But for him to actually take the courage to, listen to the disciples and stay with them, to have his faith, to have his doubts tested, that was courageous, because his faith was rewarded, and ultimately, like that ended up in his ministry and his martyrdom. So I think faith, and the same with all the other disciples, like the same with St. Peter, when he left the boat, that took a lot of courage to just leave the life that you're comfortable with. And he probably didn't even know much. He just knew that, this man walked along, put all his fish in his boat, and he's like, all right, well, follow me. And he did. So yeah, I agree with you completely. I think faith without courage isn't faith at all.
And I think almost every time, I haven't studied this, but I'm just making this up. Every time the Bible says, like, be courageous, it's almost always followed up with, for the Lord is with you, or something along those lines, right? As a reminder, like, where is your courage coming from? It's in that reminder that I'm with you. Mm-hmm.
That's what the article continues. But it says, the courage of faith is then linked to the other two virtues of hope and love. So we say faith, hope, and love. And it says one has the courage of one's faith because one also has ultimate hope or assurance of salvation. One is sure that despite the assassinations of martyrs and all the triumphs of injustice and lies, life will finally triumph over death and truth will win in the end. This is fundamentally the message of the resurrection. Faith in the resurrection means this faith that life will win over death, that truth will win over lies and injustice despite all the contrary evidence of history. So yeah, like faith, we have courage in our faith because we also have the hope of the resurrection. We have the hope of salvation, and that Christ's resurrection will triumph all. And that leads us to love. That leads us to the virtue of love.
Okay, now so imagine a congregation of courageous Christians. We're in the world now, right? So we're in the world, we may be expressing this courage. I feel like there's many ways we can be expressing this courage, and what is kind of like the duty of Christians? Is it just to stand firm in their own convictions and beliefs as it pertains to their own personal life? Or is there like a responsibility to engage in social activism against oppression, injustices, to speak truth to power, so to speak, as the prophets did, and St. John the Baptizer and many others before us did? Like, do we have a duty to be courageous beyond our own little life and for others?
Yeah, it's obviously like it's a loaded question given what's happening in the world. But I think we do, obviously. Like, we're not placed on earth just for ourselves. Like, we're not here to just live for ourselves. And like Christ says, like, you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And the second commandment is like it. So clearly like St. Paul talks about it in terms like it's a vertical and it's a horizontal thing. Like, we have the vertical duty to God, to love God, and then we also have a horizontal duty to our neighbors. But yeah, what that horizontal duty looks like, I think, is different or is interpreted differently, because like, nowhere does Christ say to, like, it's controversial, but nowhere does Christ say to protest and to, start riots and to, stand up in front of people, whatever. He just says to love. But that love is, for example, with St. Paul, he loved people, but he still admonished them, and he still, when he was talking to the Galatians, he starts off his epistles to Galatians and like he just rips straight into them. Like, he doesn't even say, I've been praying for you or whatever. He rips straight into them. So like, but he loves them. So I think how we interpret that is has been or what that love looks like is viewed differently by people.
Yeah.
And people do it differently, because like Christ obviously he stood up to things when they were wrong, like he threw the money changers out of the temple. But I can't say that Christ's purpose and his reasons for doing that, and whatever holy wrath or whatever godly wrath is equivalent to me, because like we know that divine qualities are not what our qualities are. Like they're given human definitions, but God is really above our definitions and above our logic and above our ways. Like the way that he deals with people and the way he deals with things, when we describe God's anger, or when we describe even God's like forgiveness or God's mercy or God's justice, that's a very different idea to how we describe it. And I think that sometimes we take those things and we like to apply them. Like, how many times do you hear like Christians defending the right to, protest and the right to whatever, and they're like, oh well, Christ, he threw the people out of the temple, and it's like, yeah, but you're talking about God. Like you're talking about God on the first day of Passion Week, seeing something that was actually very limited to that context. Like he was standing up against something that was actually just in that context. We can't remove the context from it. Like we can't remove the temple, and we can't remove, whatever, like, because Christ obviously was thinking about Deuteronomy and the laws of the temple, and he was thinking about what was appropriate, and he was also thinking of his death, and there was a lot of symbolism around that. So we can't remove all of that and just say, oh well, Christ, showed anger, so therefore that I can do the same thing. Oh no, like I think we have to be very careful, because and it happens all the time. Like we take St. Paul, and he says, oh, women need to be quiet at church. Mm-hmm. And then people take that and they're like, oh no, women shouldn't be deacons, and they shouldn't have a role in the mass and all this sort of thing. And it's like we have to be very careful. Like St. Paul was addressing a very particular situation in a very particular context, in a city that had a lot of problems. The Corinthians had a lot of issues. So he wrote a letter addressing a particular thing. He wasn't giving a theological teaching for the church. So I think we just got to be careful about applying God's virtues and God's qualities to our actions, especially when we do it incorrectly. Sorry, I probably went a bit off.
No, you didn't go off topic at all. I think you make a good point, because that's always a concern, that we can proof text the Bible, pick and choose the one verse that supports our opinion and our perspective and what we should do, and that's kind of dangerous. Obviously, we should look to the whole life of the church, the history of the church as a whole, and how the church has dealt with certain interaction, certain things before.
There was a passage. Again, the article that you really sent.
This article, man, it's a great article.
No, it's great.
Well, you know why it's great? Because it was written in the 1980s,
And that's the thing. Like well, I mean, towards the end, like it got a bit weird, because it was talking about like nuclear war and stuff, and I was like, oh, hang on.
Oh, yeah, context. Yeah.
And I realized. I realized it was talking about the 80s, and and again, like that's a perfect example of like something that applied to that context. And nuclear war was obviously a very real reality in the 80s, the Cold War and all that sort of thing. And so that clearly was a problem in that time that they wanted to address. But there was a bit of it that said, I just lost my spot. Sorry, I'm going to quote a lot, but it was saying the church's existence. The Christian, however, is free to embrace the concrete and finite realities in order to make them the incarnate signs and exemplars of the compassionate life. So it's talking about how courage, instead of being completely dispassionate and I'm just going to ignore the world and I'm going to just do what I think is right, courage in the Christian sense is actually to be compassionate, because the world, because the article was comparing courage in the military sense of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and how that was a quality of soldiers and not a quality of peasants and slaves and whatever. And then Christianity turned that on its head, and Christianity opened up courage to everyone, because we all now have been given the freedom, slaves and St. Paul talks about slaves and free people, Jews and Greeks. Everyone has been given this freedom. And so it says the church's existence, how should we understand this courage for the truth, which can also invest itself in compassionate service to one another? One should speak about this in many ways, but I'll choose to illustrate what this might mean in relation to two contemporary contexts, our life in the church and our socio-political life. The church's existence in society is necessarily one of tension and paradox. The church must live in history, and so it must organize itself within existing cultural and economic structures and socioeconomic structures, yet it exists to witness to the kingdom of God, to that radical alternative where God's will is done on earth. So like it has to like criticize these worldly structures, but it also must witness to the kingdom of God.
Right.
There's like this, the church has to like figure out, do I criticize it completely or do I sit back and just stay tame? And it's hard. I think
here's where I see the tension, because sticking true to what the Bible teaches us, on the one hand, we're taught to respect the authorities, to respect the laws of the lands, etc. But on the other hand, there are certain things that unequivocally Christians are against, right? So let's just think something non-controversial among Christians: abortion, right? Which is policies are being passed left and right to make it more accessible, legal, easy, yada yada.
Yeah, sure.
This is a black and white issue among Christians. That is fundamentally evil and wrong. Now, does the church simply just have that position and go about their day, a Christian go about their day accordingly, or do they have a fundamental duty to take action against the system? And we're not gonna figure out right now, me and you are in this conversation, where that line is, how far we can go. But I think we can agree we do have to push the envelope a little bit. How far we can push it, are we blocking streets and hospitals? I'm not saying, I don't know where the line is, but at the very least we can acknowledge like Christians have to be courageous in speaking out at the very least, and doing something. Where that line is ultimately, I don't know. But this also brings us to another point that I think is important. So what happens when there's a conflict between the hierarchy of the church and its members about what the church should be doing about a certain issue? I'm not going to give an example of an issue, but let's just say there's an issue and the church has taken maybe a stand back approach, or just let it be kind of approach, whereas its members want the church to stand up, fight back, defend it. What is the congregant, what is the person to do in that situation? Because on the one hand, you're commanded to be obedient to the church, but on the other hand, you have this fundamental belief that you think is correct, and you want to, in this situation, maybe it's not courage, but I think it would be courage to even speak truth to power within the church structure. Yeah,
I think, like, just to answer not to answer really, but an example of the first point, which is like where the line is, for example, with the abortion issue, like where the line is of standing up, do we sit back and just, we have our stance and that's it, and what's our duty? A great example of this, again, is St. Paul with his epistle to Philemon. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar, like, exactly with what was happening in it. I'm sure you are, but to give a very brief overview is...
I'm not, go ahead.
Yeah, to give a very, very brief rundown of the stories, Philemon was this guy in another city. I can't remember the city exactly. It might have been Corinth, possibly. I can't remember. Anyway, he had a slave, and the slave robbed him and essentially escaped and went to Rome. And St. Paul took him under his wing and basically brought him into the service and, helped him. The slave's name is Onesimus, and helped him, he got him to help St. Paul with the ministry and everything like that. But then he sent him back to Onesimus, saying, my duty is to send you back, still a slave, you still did the wrong thing, and I need to send you back. But in his epistle, he's begging kind of Onesimus, almost begging him to say, I'm happy to pay his debt. I'm happy to anything that he's done against you, but just let him go because he's useful to me if you wish. Like, that's just what I'm asking you, but it's up to you. But the example, like, I like that example because St. Paul, was well within his rights to stand up to slavery and to say we shouldn't have slaves and all this sort of thing. But he accepted that this was something that was just happening in society, and most likely as one person, he wasn't going to change it. But what he could change was individuals, and he could change hearts. And the way that he did it was through his actions. The guy could have run away to him, the slave could have run away to him, and St. Paul could have sent him right back and said, I have nothing to do with you. You need to go back to your master because this is the right thing to do. Or he, on the other end of the scale, he could have told Philemon, the master, what you're doing is wrong. As Christians, we don't believe in slavery. You should release him, blah, blah. But he didn't. He converted this guy, the slave. He converted him to Christianity. He involved him in the service. He involved his talent, and then sent him back and still paid his debts for him, and converted not only this guy, but then converted Philemon to this higher way of love, which is to release him because we have been, we were slaves to sin and Christ has released us. And so we should do the same. So he's now changed two people and most likely changed the whole church because Philemon is in charge of the church. So I think, like with the abortion, if we apply that to the abortion example, like maybe for me, I'm not going to like protest and stand up in front of government and try and change laws and policies. But maybe if someone comes to me with this dilemma of abortion, well, I will tell them, look, this is what I believe, but maybe there's a way that we can help you. Maybe if you can't actually, like I'm saying, not me, but the church's role, well, this is what we believe, but we're not just going to leave you on your own to suffer with the consequences of your mistake or what someone else potentially done to you against your will. But maybe we'll try and help you. Maybe if you can't support this baby on your own, maybe we'll try and look after this baby, or some of the funds that we have, maybe we can funnel it to looking after this baby. It's just an example, and maybe it's very unrealistic, but like maybe that's the role the church can play, which is to still stand up against the truth, but to take in with compassion these people, because that's the higher way of love. That's the way that Christ taught us, is it's always to love at any cost. And that's the way that St. Paul went about, which is the mind of Christ, which is to always crucify and empty ourselves of what we want for what Christ wants, which is to always accept these people. But yeah, so I guess again, it's a bit of a
so someone may have just listened to your example from St. Paul, and they may be thinking, great, St. Paul, you helped out the slave and his owner, great, but what about all those thousands of other slaves? Maybe if you spoke out, you could have said something, and then hey, you may have helped this one person who changed their mind about abortion, but what about if you actually stood up and fought against these laws, and maybe you would be saving millions of unborn children's lives. So it still begs the question, whether or not what St. Paul did was right or wrong. I'm not going to debate that, obviously. And whether what the church is doing now on certain issues, how they respond to certain issues, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. But when you do disagree, okay, and you think, hey, the church needs to be taking action right now, this X is a violation of our freedoms, violation of God's law, blah, blah, blah. I want them to do something about it. Okay.
Sure.
And I'll tell you from my experience, this is like how hard it is, just so you this is like a nothing example, but I remember years ago when I was in college, I thought something, and this is an example of maybe how not to do something, like how not to voice a grievance, but I had posted something on our church's like group Facebook page about a priest who was, you know, essentially teaching Protestant things, and where I just showed the parallels between what he was saying and how it was basically all plagiarized from this like Protestant teachings, books, and things like that. And I actually took what I posted, the idea from it, even though I already kind of knew this, but from Bishop Suriel posted something very similar. All right, so I post this in my church group Facebook page. First of all, it gets met with some backlash. Then I get removed from the group by Abuna, and so I'm out of the group. I'm out of the church Facebook group. So, obviously that was not effective. But if someone does want to be effective, and that's a minor internal church issue, but someone wants to be effective in getting the church to move on something that they feel passionately about, maybe it's like I don't know, the unjust treatment of people in XYZ country, right? I don't know. But what do they do? Like, what's the proper way to go?
Well, I mean, probably like I'm not criticizing you, but I mean, probably from both ends.
Go ahead, criticize.
No, like the way that situation was handled from both ends probably wasn't the best way as well. And I think just in general, like at the end of the day, we're all humans as well. Like humans, we're humans, and everyone makes mistakes, and everyone, like the way people deal with conflict is very complex, because that has a lot to do with their upbringing and their personalities, and some people are just not open to conflicts at all, and they can't deal with it, and they don't know what to do, and they just shut down. And some people are,
so there's fight or flight type people.
Yeah, and some people are just trigger happy, and they'll just fight everyone. And to give you guys an example that you might understand, because you guys love guns.
I love them. Yeah. That's why we would have to pay $5,000 fines if we don't get the vaccine.
I mean,
but go ahead.
But like, I think Christ gives the perfect like conflict resolution process in the Gospels, which is like, if you have something against someone, take it up one-on-one, and then if they don't listen, then bring someone with you to witness. And that goes back to the Jewish rules of, if there's two witnesses, then it's declared as truth. And then further to that, if he still doesn't listen to you, then you bring it to the church. And so, like, to apply it to that situation, like, let's say you have a grievance against the priest, or let's say like you don't agree with someone that they're teaching or whatever, maybe the best way to begin with is to take it up one-on-one with someone who is actually going to take action on it. And it's not, because I think taking it up with people who actually have no influence and no direct control over things that can change, I think it just ends up being gossip and rumor. And it's just, there's nothing beneficial that can come out of it. Like, there's nothing, that, like, sure, I can talk to my friend about X, Y, and Z, person or leader or servant or whatever that did something to me, but can my friend actually change anything? Probably not. And in that case, it's probably just gossip and rumoring, and spreading gossip. But if I bring it someone who actually can change things, well, then I'm actually taking action, and I'm avoiding gossip, and I'm avoiding misinformation, and I'm not embarrassing that person, and I'm not exposing them. Like, there's a great example of this in Father Dan Fanus's book, the Pope K book, The Silent Patriarch, about this particular priest who his congregation loves him in Egypt, but he was defrauding the congregation in terms of just mismanaging financial affairs, and I think potentially even stealing money. I can't remember the exact details, but it was a scandal, and it wasn't obviously in the best interest of the church and whatever. So the Pope obviously knew about it, and the Pope, his first action was, with no notice or anything, was just to remove the priest from the church completely. He just recalled him back, kind of like how you got removed from your Facebook group. But he got removed, and for 6 months, constantly, the Pope copped it in the newspaper, in just like priests and bishops and the church itself that the priest was leading. Just
they're complaining,
complaining, and I mean, it was a bad time for the Pope anyway. Like, he wasn't having a good run of it because everyone was like, "Oh, who's all this guy does is pray, and no one ever sees him, and he's not leading the church." And it was in general a very bad time for him as well. And I mean, the church also wasn't in a good state because they had just come off this period of popes who were corrupt and whatever, and the Pope K inherited really a church that had fallen apart. So it just wasn't a good time. And then he did this, and it was just it put gas on the fire, or petrol on the fire. And then later on, once he passed away, it came out that the Pope had taken this priest and in a very personal way had corrected him, had involved him in some services, and had involved him in praying the mass with him daily, and then returned him to that church. And he was willing to cop it. He's willing to cop all that, all the unjust remarks and all the misinformation about it, all the rumors and whatever, just so that he could fix this priest's problem and fix the mistake that he made and return him to his church, because he knew that was the best thing. But the way that he did it was taking on that person's reputation, taking on that person's burden, instead of exposing the priest and writing he could have written a letter to the church and say, well, your priest did X, Y, and Z wrong, and this is why he's being removed and all this sort of thing. But he was willing to cop it for a greater purpose, which is the purpose of love, which is not only did he rehabilitate this priest and showed him love, because most likely if he'd taken him and exposed him, the priest would have not really come back and probably would have left the church and might have even, not wanted to be a priest anymore. I don't know, like, who knows? Like, maybe the Pope would have avoided a backlash against himself, but he would have lost a priest and maybe lost the congregation as well, because maybe the priest actually benefited this congregation in a spiritual way, but he was still making a mistake. So I think, like, back to your point, I think, like, that's the perfect example of, if you have a problem with someone, take it up one-on-one. Like, that's a literal carrying out of that commandment, taking it up one-on-one at whatever cost, like, that he was willing to bear that cost. And that's the example of Christ, that we empty ourselves of our own pride and ego and the desire to stand up for ourselves, and we empty ourselves of that for the greater purpose of love, which is, okay, let's say I stand up against this issue, but am I going to lose people in this whole process? Are people going to be turned away from Christ in this whole process? Because how many times you see Christians protesting, but it paints Christianity in a very negative way. It shows us to be fanatics, and it shows God to be an angry God. Because you hear, how can God, who is loving, hate gays or hate whatever? Because what is the world seeing? The world is seeing Christians carrying out His commandment not in an effective way. So it's a hard look. I'm not giving you an answer because I don't know. It's such a hard.
Well, to be honest, kind of what I'm getting from you is that mass movements are pretty difficult, and that we should focus on interpersonal, one-to-one type things. I just think, kind of in the society we live in today, when you think of change, when you think of a movement, it necessarily kind of includes something's going viral, things are happening fast, people are moving together. There's some kind of unifying thing. So, think about this practically. Like, I want the bishop to change his whole strategy on how he's dealing with some social issue. I don't know. I could set up a meeting maybe 2 months from now, and we might have a 10-minute conversation. Is that going to do anything? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Am I going to lose? Is it going to preserve the love and relationship with me and the bishop? Probably, because I was respectful and
Sure.
I just took 10 minutes of his
Yeah.
time. However, what if
Sure.
I felt really passionately about this and I did it the good old-fashioned American way, and just got a whole bunch of people interested and involved,
Yeah.
and now they're
Yeah. Yeah.
all emailing him and texting him and
Yeah. Yeah.
calling him.
Sure.
That's kind of, should we be doing that? I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with doing that in the world, as long as, the cause is proper and you're doing it out of love and for the truth. Then how people judge you and label you and things like that, I don't worry too much
Yeah.
about. But within
Yeah.
the
Sure.
church,
Sure.
there's that added element of I actually owe an obedience and level of, deference to the hierarchy that I don't really think I owe to any, man-made institution,
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we navigate that if, maybe the answer is just approach it one by one and
Yeah.
respectfully and pray about it. And, that could be the answer. I'm not saying that's not the answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
But am I understanding you
Yeah.
correct? And that's what you think is like the best way?
I agree with it. Look, I think it's hard because, and again, I think in America things are a lot different to Australia as well. Like, I think we don't care enough, to be honest. Look, some people do, but I think and maybe there's this like you have to remember as well, like maybe this is also my personality in that, like coming out as well. Like everyone does things in a different way as well, not on a spiritual level or anything like that, but just personality wise, people are different. But I think in terms of the mass movement thing, like, look, I think 100%, like, let's say you have a clear issue and everyone is complaining about this and everyone is telling the bishop about this, like, that will probably, yes, like, the bishop is human, and once he sees, okay. There's more than one. More than one person. Yeah.
Let me give you an actual example of this, and
Sure.
maybe this is a bad example, but this is an example that's coming to my mind right now.
Sure.
Recently, I think it was in the last year or so, a young lady came out about being like sexually abused by a priest, and this priest was not defrocked, and he was just moved around churches, and bishops knew about this, people knew about this, and nothing happened for quite some time until I don't know the details, but essentially something did happen. It felt like once there was social media attention, maybe that led to some pressure. I don't know. I don't really know the details about it, so I don't really want to comment on it, but that's kind of an example of what I mean by things may not happen until there's pressure within the church. Should we be mobilizing like that? Personally, it doesn't seem that proper to me, but something really is.
I mean,
important.
my issue with that stuff is not the issue itself and people standing up. It's just 70 to 80% of the time, I'd say, that when you do see people speaking up about it in a public domain, it's not for the intentions of correcting anyone or for the intention, like, it's not done with love. Is essentially what I'm saying. I'm not judging anyone, and everyone does things in a different way, and of course I'm sure that people have good intentions. I'm sure they do, and most people really do. And even, like, if we look at left-wing movements and social justice movements and all that sort of thing, racism and sexism and all that sort of stuff, like, at the core of it, like, there are good intentions. Like, sure, I don't, like, who wants to disrespect people of the opposite race or sex? Who wants to bully people? Like, no one. Like, but the problem is the way that it's executed. And, like, going back to the example of let's say the priest that was preaching something wrong, or the priest that whatever, and for me to go on Facebook and just complain about him and just say, not even in a church group, I think that you had good intentions because you did it within a closed church group and you were highlighting an issue. But for me to just go on, like, my Facebook feed or Instagram, whatever, and just rant about it, it's like, well, do I actually care about that person and trying to correct contact him, because if I did, I would probably go to them one-on-one first. Like, do I care? And have I, like, what am I trying to get out of it? Like, with me posting on Facebook and like I said, I'm not trying to attack you at all. Like, I don't know what the situation was.
Man, I'm getting killed on my own podcast here.
Sorry if I'm using
Don't worry, man. Like, this was a while ago. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So, like, for me to just rant about it publicly, like, what's my purpose? Is my purpose to bring attention to myself and to generate conversation and debate and, get people against this priest to try and stand up for, to try and, bring him down or whatever, to have something personal against him? Because I think you would argue that if it was personal, and if I genuinely had the intention of if I had the church at heart, like if I saw the church as the bride of Christ, as the beloved of Christ, that Christ died for her and sacrificed his blood for her, if that is my intention, then I would take every single precaution and every single care and every single, like, always in my mind, it'll be, how can I protect the church? How can I do this, but make sure that the church is not harmed? Not the, like, because the church is the bishop, is the priest, is the congregation, is, like, yes, I have something against the bishop, but in me attacking the bishop or me attacking the priest, have I harmed the rest of the church? Have I harmed the church's reputation? Have I harmed, the bishop himself? Have I taken care to make sure that this person isn't harmed? And if we bring it down,
here's the problem with that. Yeah. None of us are omnipotent. None of us knows what. You have to weigh the harms, right? Because there is also a harm of not speaking out against somebody who's preaching false teachings, right? So
of course,
this applies to almost any situation where you're going to speak out or take some certain action. You can try to weigh the harms, but I don't think you'll ever really know what, so I agree. You have to come at it with at least the right intention and from a place of love. And I think that's where, like, guidance and from someone elder and wiser than you is important.
100%. And I think that's really where wisdom plays its role, because all this done without wisdom is just it's arrogance and
overconfidence, brashness.
Overconfidence is brashness, and at the end of the day, like I said, it causes more harm than good, because not only are we supposed to show love to the people in the church, but the people outside the church as well. And so when they see that we're, number one, not united, and that we're fighting against each other in a way that is not loving, like, sure, it's fine to debate each other like we're doing right now. It's fine to have differing opinions, and it's fine to, I would say, even criticize with love, and that's fine. But again, what is the purpose? Is the purpose just for me to get my opinion in and for me to get, to change what I want? Or is my purpose God's purpose, which is to make sure that his body is looked after and that his body loves each other and that we are all acting in the same way towards God? And at the end of the day, like, we're not talking about a human institution that is just human. Like, we're talking about the body of Christ that Christ died for. And so at the end of the day, it's God's church. It's not our church. It's not just a human institution. It's the church that Christ died for and that he came to bring to life. Like, the church doesn't exist without the crucifixion and the resurrection. The church was a direct consequence of Christ dying on the cross. That's what gave birth to the church, is the Holy Spirit coming there. So, like, sure, I might criticize someone at work, I might criticize the government's policies, I might criticize whatever. But when I criticize the church, I'm criticizing Christ's bride. Like, I'm criticizing the Holy Spirit, the work of the Holy Spirit. So I have to remember at the end of the day as well that, like, he will have the final say. And, like, sure, there is injustice, but, like, God will avenge in his own way. God will have his vengeance. And if we decide to try and do it our own way, like, that's what happened in the Old Testament. Like, you had the prophets and you had, the nation of Israel, but they decided that wasn't good enough. They decided we wanted a king. We wanted things done out of our own way. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe I haven't researched this enough, but I'm not like, I don't know, but I feel like when there's been like mass movements in the Bible, it's always ended badly. Like you had like Moses and the people of Israel, there was a mass movement to create an idol, and Aaron created the idol. And then there was a mass movement to, crucify Christ, and he was crucified. But there have been good mass movements as well. There have been, when there was an outcry of Israel to leave Egypt, and there was a mass exodus. So, sure, mass movements are good, but I feel like in the majority of the time, when the mass has banded together to do something, it has always ended badly. Like the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark. It was one person against the world. It was the Tower of Babel. It was a group of people thinking that we can build a tower to God. The statue of Baal. It was a nation thinking that God had forgotten them. So I think the group mentality can also be quite toxic, because you leave God out of it. Like the whole idea, okay, like unity is good, but who is head of the unity? So I think if you're united and God is your head, that's blessed, and that's actually what the church is supposed to be. A body with God as its head, Christ is the head. But then you chop the head off and you decide to be united. Well, you're united under, you're not united under the devil. The devil has become your head. So I think that's what we have to be careful of is, sure, let's be united and let's band together, but we need to make sure we're banding together under the correct head. Does that make sense? That's just the way I see it. Like,
No. I see where you're coming from.
The Bible, like whenever anyone has banded together and united, but decided to leave God out of that unity, it's ended up badly.
Okay.
But when they've united together under a purpose for God, it's ended up well. Like Jericho, the fall of Jericho, that was the nation of Israel banding together. The rebuilding of the wall, that was the nation of Israel banding together. So there are lots of examples of people banding together, but I think group mentality, when it's not in the right direction, can be especially, and as well, group mentality, I think, when people neglect their own personal responsibilities as well. Like when I haven't examined myself to make sure that I've, to quote one of my favorite secularists, debated whether he's secular or not, but Jordan Peterson, one of his kind of like fundamental rules is, clean up your own room. So like, how can I tell other people how to do things? Like, how can I tell the church how to run things and what's right and what's wrong if in my own life I still haven't gotten it right? And his point isn't not to stand up for other people and not to stand up against these things, but his point is, start with yourself first, because once everyone does their own bit correctly, then the cause that you stand up for, you'll stand up for it in a correct way. But if I'm broken and I haven't done things correct, like I haven't examined myself to make sure that I'm also the best person that I can be, and each person in that group hasn't done the same thing, well, then the way that you fight against this cause probably won't be done in the best way as well, because it's a bunch of people who have neglected their own responsibilities first. And I think the church teaches us that as well. Like the church teaches us, first repent. We first repent. We first experience the mercy of God. We first love God, and then we give that love to others. And so when we love God properly, and when God loves us properly, like when we experience the love of God and understand his love properly, then I'm able to portray that love in the correct way. And if I don't do that properly, then what I think is love, like when I protest against a particular issue and I think that it's love, it's not actually love. It's my idea of love, which I haven't gotten from God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sorry, I was a bit long-winded, my bad.
No. I mean, that was all good stuff. I think we can keep talking about this there's
Yeah.
so many different nuances and so many things I want to get
Yeah.
into, to be honest with you, because every
I know.
every two sentences you say, I'm like, oh, I want to catch on to that. That's a good
I'm
point.
sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I
Um,
tend to have a habit of just rambling on, but
no,
um,
that was great. I'll just make like one quick point. I think
yeah, please. Yeah.
something to keep in mind is that I don't think there's a I don't think there's like a uniform uh, Christian uh, like teaching on how you have to express you know any dissension or things like that. I think part of it has to do with where the church culture and tradition is. Like, for example, in America, obviously
Yeah.
the culture is different than growing up in like
Yeah.
church in communist Russia or Soviet
Mhm.
Union back in the day. So those expressions of activism are just going to be different. But
Of course.
lots to talk about. I appreciate you so much for coming on, man. Can you just like plug the podcast real quick? Tell people where they can listen to it, because this,
Yeah.
this obviously this like is going to get 1 million views. So and once I tell people you're going to be on it, but yes,
No,
I
no.
really benefit from it. I think it's an awesome podcast, and the production level is like way better than this. And I think you do some of the editing, and the sound quality is so great. So how do people like tap into it?
Yeah, so I guess like we try and cover issues like men's mental health, masculinity. We've done like a relationship and a marriage series, and we've just finished a sexuality series as well, like how we view things like pornography and sex before marriage and that sort of thing. So yeah, if we've almost like 47, I think 48% of our listeners are females. Also, by no means is it just for men, but it's something that as men we found a lot of these issues just bearing on our mind. So yeah, feel free to listen. Please like give us feedback on topics that you want to hear and questions and that sort of thing. And we're on Apple Podcasts, Upper Room Media, and Spotify as well. And I'll give a plug to Upper Room Media as well, which
Yeah. No, it's a great
uh,
app. Yeah, I have the app. I think it's great.
yeah, yes,
A lot of Aussie voices in there, so I got to get used to the
yeah,
accent. But
an American voice as well. So
no, no. And
we
the
love our
Instagram, social media handles,
yeah. So
anything
we're on
like that?
Instagram as well. So the Righteous Men's on Instagram, right?
Okay.
It's I think Righteous Men _ you'll find us and Facebook as well. So yeah, like feel free to have a listen and spread the word and yeah, we hope to start to get more guests as well from the States and to start to really possibly do video next year as well. We're tossing up how we can do that because it's audio is easy to edit. Video is a whole kettle of rice. So
Yeah.
we'll
All right.
see.
Well,
But
thanks so much again, Mark, man. I really appreciate it. It was a lot
man,
of
I
fun.
enjoyed the chat. It was a really good talk to you. So hopefully you can do it again soon.